everybody. Thank you all for turning out tonight. It's really good to see so many of you actually, and it's lovely to have you all here tonight. If it just let you find a few chairs. We are live streaming as well, so welcome to anybody that's on the internet and is watching us over Wi-Fi or live streaming in their bedroom. And we're not in our pajamas here, but I wish I was, to be honest. The agenda for tonight, we're going to have a few introductions, a bit of housekeeping to start off with, and then hopefully you're all in the room for the Prevention of Discrimination Ordinance. Otherwise, you're in the wrong room, so I don't mind if you want to get up and leave now, that's fine. So, providing you are all here for that, we will have a bit of a presentation from me to start off with, just so to give you some idea of what the legislation says itself. Then we've got questions from you guys. So whilst I'm going through the slides, please, if you've got any questions, think about them, write them down, make a note. Myself and our honoured guests from the team at Social Security, so including their Minister, Deputy Peter Roffey, and the Secretary of Social Security, Ellen Pragnell, will be with us on forming the panel. And Jill will be helping out as well in terms of finding questions that have been sent through the ether. So we're really pleased that you've all joined us tonight as well. And then after the panel session, there will be just an opportunity of finding out how you can help us get this legislation through, and what we are going to do in terms of celebrating and making sure that we make the final push a very happy and celebratory one. So, just on the housekeeping, I'm Carol LePage, if nobody's met me before. I'm the Director of Social Policy at the GDA, and we job share, me and Karen job share, so Karen's title is the Partnership Director, and I do all the social policy stuff. So welcome to everybody. If you could just check in with your neighbours, make sure everybody's can hear, because sometimes it's tricky not to, everyone's okay, they can hear the volume. We have had a couple of issues with the mic, so if there is any problems, please do let us know. Teas and coffees are at the back with water on the tables, and there's some more at the back. If you could put your phones on silent or vibrate, that would be great. Obviously, people I know need to take photos and put stuff on social media, and if you've got babysitters, so don't worry if you're playing with your phones. We're quite happy with that. It's just that it might interrupt us if they're not on quiet. Fire alarm, we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if one goes off, it's a real one. There is a exit behind me here, or through that door with a green light over it, and then exit the building through the archway and out. Toilets equally through that door and on the right there. And questions, as I say, if you want to keep them till we get to the panel stage, we'll try and get through the first part of the presentation relatively at a pace, so that you have got enough information and details, and then if you've got a burning issue about a certain bit of legislation, we may not have covered it, because obviously this is quite a high level treetop one, then you can ask the panel at the end. The timing, which I hadn't put up there, we should be finished by 8 o'clock, so we will be hanging around for another half hour after that, if anybody's got any further questions. Could somebody let Simon in? Otherwise, you'll be free to go after 8, and if anybody needs to go before, that's fine. So, without further ado, if there's nothing else, we shall crack on. So that's the first bit over and done with. So, the full title of the anti-discrimination legislation that's coming in is the Prevention of Discrimination Guernsey Ordinance 2022, which might give the impression that it's going to come into effect in 2022, but unfortunately it will be next year before we actually see it coming in, providing it's agreed by the states on the 28th of September, which is when they are due to meet and discuss it. One of the first things that all of us that have been involved in the legislation over the last 15 years or so, certainly from the GDA's background, I was originally on the state side, so many years ago I was working in the position looking at the legislation from the other side. But one of the first things that came up was what the definitions are, who is protected. So everybody should be protected from discrimination. Discrimination isn't something that should be happening in terms of treating people unfavourably because of the colour of their skin, the fact they have an impairment, the fact they're a carer, they may be, in a different sort of relationship or have a different belief. What this particular ordinance will cover is what we call protected grounds. So it doesn't mean to say that you everybody has race, everybody has some sort of sexual orientation, everybody has some sort of religious belief, whether it's you have a belief or you don't have a belief, they're both covered. So carer status and disability are slightly different, but as I said, everybody should be protected from all the prohibited discrimination that is in the legislation. So when we're talking about describing all of these protected grounds, we're talking about it in relation to discrimination and discrimination having happened. So if you haven't got an impairment, you can still be discriminated against on the grounds of disability. So we will come on to that. It is quite a weird and peculiar concept, but it is not, it just focuses the mind on, it's not about the disability, it's about the ground. So you're not talking about somebody's impairment, but you're talking about the ground of disability being protected. And that's slightly different to the UK, which uses characteristics. So it's more focused on you and what your own characteristic is. We've moved away from that over here, which is good news as far as we're concerned, because it's much more a social human rights type of model rather than, and that means you're looking at what society can do, not what the person who is being discriminated can do. So we have, in this phase of the legislation, disability, carer status, race, sexual orientation and religious belief. But that's not all that's coming. Provided phase 1 gets through in September, more is coming down the line. So age isn't covered at all at the moment. Age is going to be a new ground that will be a protected ground in phase 2. And then sex, pregnancy and maternity, marital status and gender reassignment. There is already some protection in employment, but they will be protected in other areas. So goods, services, landlord, education, accommodation. So there will be much more, much more to come in terms of the different protected characteristics. So in the press and at various other times, there's been a lot of debate over and concerns, criticisms over what a protected ground of discrimination is. So one of the things that we look at is also what the type of discrimination is. So with direct discrimination, all of the protected grounds have to exist, or they have to have previously existed, but may no longer exist, or they exist in the future. The other thing is they may be imputed. So this is where you don't actually have to have an impairment, but I can say that somebody, or I think that somebody has an impairment, and I discriminate on the grounds of disability because I think they have an impairment. Now, one of the things in the 80s, obviously, was with HIV coming in, there was a lot of discrimination on the gay community on the basis that all people with that sexual orientation would have HIV, which was absolute load of nonsense. But that's an example of an imputed. So no, they didn't have, but they were discriminated on the basis that people thought they did. So we can all be discriminated against on the grounds of disability, whether we have an impairment or not. So I think it is a more difficult concept to get over, the imputed bit, but let's not forget that this is to prevent discrimination. This is not a disability legislation, this is prevention of discrimination legislation. So we have been trying to campaign to make sure that the ground of disability is as wide as possible. And throw the doors open. Let's have as many people in as possible that will be covered by this ground, because what we're trying to do is prevent the discrimination. But people do get confused and worried that if there's a massive, great big protected ground defined over here of disability, that when they're looking at resourcing something, they're worried that all of these people may also fall into that. So it's very different things. So if you're looking at making sure your hospital is equipped, that you have sufficient benefits, that everybody is catered for and resourced, that's different to protecting people from discrimination. So we have been trying to get it as wide as possible, but other people have been trying to narrow it down so that they can discriminate against other, people on the basis of the ground of disability. So we've come to a compromise on this, and there is a lot of compromises as we go through. I'll spend a little bit more time because obviously we are the GDA after all, so strangely enough we will be talking about the ground of disability slightly more than some of the other slides. But the essence is that a time period was put in, so that was one of the things that we didn't want to happen, but has happened, and we're happy that the legislation has come to a balanced agreement now. So we're not saying this is an awful piece of legislation, let's not have it. We're saying this is a compromised piece of legislation that we feel is great, and we want it to come in. But there are things that we feel people have been mentioning in the paper that you might not understand why there is this difference. So the first big difference really has been, and has always been, the very first meetings that we had actually have always were about the definition of disability. So it has come to this as a long-term impairment which has lasted or expected to last more than 6 months. So it doesn't have to have already lasted 6 months if it's expected to last 6 months, or is expected to last until the end of the person's life. Then you're covered from the day you get that diagnosis. But the problem is you obviously need that diagnosis to then say that I'm covered. Otherwise, you'd have to wait the 6 months and then say, well, I've had this for 6 months. It was to stop people were worried that people that had coughs and colds and flu or other very self-limiting diseases might be covered under the legislation. From our point of view, we weren't worried. The legislation is about prevention of discrimination, so it's not going to, if somebody was actually discriminating against somebody because they had a cough or a cold, why shouldn't they get some protection? So there is this balancing act. So in calculating that 6-month period, if you have, say, remitting MS or something like that, where you are going to be fine 1 minute and not fine the next minute or the next day or the next month, it doesn't mean to say that you have to start the clock again. So it calculates the periods, including any remission. And equally, if you've got your symptoms under control and you're being treated, then it equally means that that period is also counted. So it is the clock starts from as soon as possible, basically. If there's any doubt, one of the things that people wanted added was if there's any doubt, medical evidence can be sought, and that's sensible, but it was something that through the consultation process, people wanted to make it very clear in the actual ordinance. So in the ordinance, it mentions disability and impairment, and they're not entirely interchangeable, but have similar sorts of connotations. So from the GDA's point of view, we talk about the impairment being, the physical feature, what has happened to them, the malformation. There is, it's whatever the problem is to them in their own bodies, whereas the disability is the barriers that society has put up in the way to mean that they are disabled. So if you're a wheelchair user and you're on a flat surface, you haven't got any barriers in the way, that's you still have an impairment, but you may not have a disability. So that's what we call the social model of disability, and it's slightly different to how various other people who might be looking for changes to the legislation might think of it. So they think in a very medical termed model, so it may be that they will be thinking more about impairment than actually what are the barriers that need removing. And what we want people to think about is the barriers that need removing, because that will mean that society is much more accessible to us all. So we've got, as part of this disability definition, we have what is meant by impairment. So, and that goes through, there are similarities to other pieces of legislation, so it's not a million miles away. It should cover everything. The ones that cause criticism or have caused criticism from certain quarters have been these two, which are conditions that result in a person's learning differently. So, everybody does learn differently, but what you have to read is the first bit of that. So it's a conditional malfunction. So what we're talking about here is people perhaps with dyslexia would be covered by this, who you might not think necessarily as being disabled in your initial pass, or many people wouldn't. And then the other one is a condition or illness or disease that affects a person's thought process. So everybody thinks slightly differently. That's not what this means. It's going back to that first bit, condition, illness or disease. So what we're talking about is things like autism, other conditions that would affect people's mental behaviour, and it's very difficult to put all these things in and then think, have we covered everything? So this is from different pieces of legislation around the world do use these types of definitions. So it has been an area that's been tested previously. And I think it is something that it'll be interesting to see how people view this as we move forward and go through actually using the legislation. But it's really the why this is in there at all is to help the tribunal process so that there's guidance and understanding of what is or what isn't going to be covered under the grounds of disability. So how is the protected ground of carer status defined? So I'm not going to cover all of the grounds, you'll be pleased to know, but I thought you'd be probably interested in those two, the grounds of disability and the grounds of carer status. So carer status is a lot more simple. It basically says that it's reliant on somebody with a disability, and the legislation says person's disability, so you'll have to excuse that if you're very much into the UN Convention side of things, but that's the way that it's phrased. So it's not a carer if you are a carer of a young child, but it is a carer of anybody regardless of their age if they have a disability, and you need to be living in the same accommodation, or you need to be a close relative, and the close relative areas are all defined in the legislation as well. Ask questions if you want at the end on that, but it's it is all set out in the legislation. So the discrimination is prohibited in the legislation. So there's the main four types. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail on this, just a whistle-stop tour. So direct discrimination, that's if you're, to your face, treated less favourably. An individual is treating you less favourably. And say you're trying to get into a nightclub and you're with somebody, and the bouncer at the door says, no, you two can't come in because, we don't allow people with Down syndrome or autism in. So if you're with that person, you will also be discriminated against. And that's so the person who has the impairment, it would have the direct discrimination. But if you're also with them and you're being discriminated because you're with them, then that's discrimination by association. Now, in other countries, discrimination by association also covers carers. Obviously covers friends and anybody that's with you, but it covers carers in the way of if you're employed, so that if you need time off to take somebody to an appointment or something like that, then discrimination by association is covered there. The way we are covering it in Guernsey is actually really a great new way of doing it, which is carer status has its own ground. So it is there's no qualms or discussion over whether it's covered or whether it isn't. It's clearly defined in the legislation, which is brilliant. Indirect discrimination, this is where it applies to rules and a group rather than individual, but it would be an individual that is discriminated against, but it's where, for instance, the HR policy means that you have to come into an interview room which is on the 3rd floor, and we only interview on that floor, and it's got bright lights and curtains that you can't stand, and so people may not be able to get up there when they're there. It may not be an environment that they're going to give their best. So there's a lot of things that we do which are policies or procedures or just our way of doing things in terms of practice that are discriminatory, and that because it's not in a direct discrimination in terms of saying, no, you can't work here, or no, you can't come to this nightclub. It's called indirect discrimination. The discrimination arising from disability is because something as a consequence of a person's disability. So it sort of says what it does on the tin there. But the get out clause is for any organisation or company where it can't be shown to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So that's a little phrase that comes into things quite a bit. So this means that if I want to be a taxi driver and I have a terrible visual impairment, that my boss will say, you can't be a taxi driver because you aren't going to get your license and therefore we can't have you as a taxi driver. That's a legitimate aim, is having safe taxi drivers, and that's a proportionate means is having an eye test before you come and become a taxi driver. So something like that is, I know, I'm sure there'll be other things that crop up in that, but it's a test that has been used elsewhere, so there is some case law around that, which is why it's this strange phrase. But we'll see whether that gets used very much or not in the future, because it's a way of getting out of being caught in the discrimination legislation. What other acts are prohibited? Victimisation. That's where you've made a complaint and somebody's then doing something nasty to try and stop you making the complaint under the legislation, is the shorthand version of that. Harassment is where it's an ongoing, longer-term thing. As with sex discrimination, if you advertise for a female worker or a male worker, then that's the sort of thing that won't be allowed anymore. Basically, nobbling somebody, causing obstruction, or inciting somebody else to do something that is a prohibited act. So my boss tells me to do something, my boss can't claim that he didn't do it. He's the one that has caused or instructed me to do a prohibited act, so that would be prohibited too. There's a whole chunk, and I mean a whole chunk, of conduct that is prohibited at work. So I won't go into that, but I know Nikki's sat there, and Barry and a few others that are more Guernsey Employment Trust. So they would be very interested in all of those types of things. And then conduct prohibited in other circumstances. So goods, services, education, clubs, associations, accommodation, all of that will be covered as well as work. So when I said about the phase 2 and those things like marital status and sex, that is not covered in the current discrimination ordinances. So this goes much wider. It covers all areas of your life, basically. So it's it will cover the states, it will cover the nightclub owner, it will cover going to the theatre, it will cover the schools and your accommodation provider as well, if you have a landlord. So there are some duties for reasonable adjustment. Now, reasonable adjustment's just brilliant. It is something that this legislation is bringing in and is absolutely amazing. So reasonable adjustment is something that you can let people know that you have a problem and they have to reduce that barrier. So they can reduce that barrier through changing their interview process. So instead of the 3rd floor with the disgusting curtains, you're on an accessible place in a nice room that's well lit and comfortable. They can change physical features, so you might need a grab rail to get up some stairs. Physical features aren't coming in for a little bit, but I'll get on to that. But some physical features, and certainly asking for physical features, is worth doing if that means that you can then do your job. And the other thing is provision of auxiliary aid. So there was a case in Jersey, actually, recent case, where somebody needed to sit down and stand up because they couldn't work for a full day in one position. And sort of a lectern like this would have done where they could stand and type. So this sort of thing is about 300 quid. And they would have a desk alongside. The people that they worked for didn't provide that lectern. They ended up paying, I think it was about 50, it was one of the highest Jersey cases, so I think it was about 50,000 in the end that they ended up with court fees, paying the awards and other provisions. So it's definitely from disability point of view, is a very big duty on the organisation, but it does mean that it's something that can be asked. They have to consult you so that if you need something, they have to say, you know, what's going to be best for you. So it's not just they buy the cheapest or they buy something. They might buy the most expensive, but it's no use if it doesn't work. So one of the things that they have to do is actually consult you. It says it shouldn't be. It's substantial disadvantage. So what it means, though, that's substantial disadvantage. It's not just trivial. So you know, you're not looking at a couple of paper clips and I don't know. It has to be that. It's a substantial disadvantage that you have been put at, and if they make their duty, that you won't be at that disadvantage any longer, and the barrier will be reduced or completely disappear.
Can we just mention that the average cost is normally between 250 and 460? Just in case people are
Yeah, so if you didn't hear that, the average cost is 250 and
between 250 and 460 pounds.
There we go, 460. Yeah, and that depends, yes, very much on the source. But I think the American one was more the 460, and the A-class UK one was more the 250. So whether that's it does vary on which research you read. So the duty bearer has a couple of get out of jail clauses here. So they don't need to provide the reasonable adjustment if it's a disproportionate burden. And that's another little phrase, and it's that phrase because there's case law elsewhere. And that means that the tribunal can then rely on that phrase so that they know it's been tested and what it means. So guidance will be coming out fairly soon on what some of these strange technical phrases mean. But that's really much more a financial burden is what they're looking at. So if it's a small business, say an accountancy firm with 3 people doing bookkeeping and accounts, and somebody needs a lift installing so that they can get up to their 3rd floor office, that would be a disproportionate burden. But they can do a reasonable adjustment by getting them to work at home, and perhaps have any meetings they need in an accessible environment, and plan to move eventually to a much more accessible environment, and that would be fine. So that's a reasonable adjustment as well. So they don't need to go for, we have a lot of concerns over, do people need to install lifts? And the answer generally is no. There's other ways to make the reasonable adjustment, and it needs to be reasonable for both parties. The other thing is, if they don't know, so if you haven't told them that you need something and they haven't got any clue that you have a disability or an impairment that requires you to overcome barriers, then that's equally a get out of jail free card. But I would say The but there is, if you've had an employee that you know and has been working with you for a number of years, pretty much you should know that if there's a barrier, you should know what their records are like, what they can and can't do, and what their sickness records may be. So there will be hints, and if you know your staff, that is not a get out of jail free card, because if you're a good manager, you'll know your staff, you'll know even if they haven't told you that something may be wrong. So, and they don't need to have told you. And there is lots of case law around that. But from our point of view, much better if you say, I need this because, and there's no qualms then that they then will have to look at whether they can provide it and what's the best way of providing that, or providing something else that's a reasonable adjustment. So, little bit about what can you do if you do get discriminated against. We hope that the legislation will encourage people to get trained and will mean that there isn't any discrimination, but on the basis that that hasn't happened anywhere else in the world, we're not going to assume that it's going to happen here. So if you do get discriminated against, there is a proper process now that will be coming in with this legislation that means not only can you find out more information, say, this has happened, what do you think? So that will be the Employment and Equal Opportunities Service. They will be the first port of call. There'll be pre-complaint conciliation, there'll be tribunal following that, and then if it goes all the way through and there's been legal problems or other issues, then there is an appeals process as well. I won't dwell on that. The awards from all of that, the tribunal will be able to make awards, and awards are in sort of two parts really. One is what you've actually lost. So if you have been dismissed because of you can't take your caring responsibilities and your job, and because of that you may have been late for an appointment or something's happened and then you've been dismissed, or there is a way round that if you've lost out because of the discrimination, then that loss can be provided for, and that is up to, if it's goods and services or education or anything apart from employment, it will be up to a maximum of £10,000. So you might have planned your wedding and something's happened. They said, oh, sorry, no, sorry, we can't now take you. We're going to, sorry, just, we didn't realise it was you lot, or, whatever it might be. And you've been discriminated against. You might lose more than £10,000 because weddings are pretty expensive. You might have to go somewhere else. You might have been planning, all sorts of things. So you might have actually lost more than £10,000 because you'll have people coming in for the wedding, and but your actual loss won't be provided in the tribunal. It'll only be up to £10,000. If it's work, though, then it will be higher. You can get up to 6 months' pay. So that's the difference. The injury to feelings is the other bit. So you've got your actual loss. So my wedding's not happened. I've got to pay all these airlines off because my family was coming from the UK. So you've got that actual loss, which should, as I say, be recompensed. But you've then got this, actually, that was pretty nasty what they did, and I feel really hurt, and I'm not sure I want to go through with all of this again, type feeling. And that's all been pretty miserable, and my fiance's decided he doesn't fancy doing that anymore, and so there's a whole lot of stuff that comes in under injury to feelings, and it's somebody that has suffered. You know, this isn't just, you know, oh, well, don't like you. It is actually somebody that's suffered, and there will be levels of how badly you have been treated and how much you have suffered. And there is an award for that as well, and that's up to 10,000, but there will be bands in that 10,000. So if it's a minor or middle or high level of, there'll be different bands. So that's just an example of the work one. So it's up to 6 months' pay, or if there's no pay, it's 10,000, and then the injury to feelings is a maximum of 10,000. So you can see the total compensation there is 6 months plus 10k, or the maximum of 20k. So it's just one of the examples. So there is a financial award that is available. There is also the tribunal can say you need to do that, you need to put this right, you need to, you know, reinstate somebody, or that tends not to work, the reinstatement bit, but they may say you need to provide something or do something. So it's not all financial, but that's going to be the main area. Now, injury to feelings, I think because of its name, injury to feelings, comes up with a bit of criticism from some areas, but it's a very common thing to have. And if we didn't have it, say you went into a paper shop, they decided not to serve you and decide also not to deliver your paper. So you might have, you know, had an arrangement with them. Really, your financial loss is going up to the next paper shop and saying, you know, I'm here, I'll buy your paper, and you're happy to serve me, whereas the lot down the road weren't. So the financial loss there is only the paper, but how you've been treated may have been appalling down the road, and may have been in front of lots of people. They may have then slagged you off in the media. So your injury to feelings and the suffering that you've got from that can be quite big. So there is injury to feelings in Jersey, that is 5,000, and injury to feelings in the UK, I think, is nearly 50,000. It's not quite 50,000, but it's very close to 50,000. So it's not an unusual thing to award, and it's so that the actual legislation has some teeth as well, because otherwise people wouldn't bother taking any claims. So I think it's important it stays, and it's important it's sufficiently high to ensure that the legislation actually is taken seriously. So the future. Well, the future, this starts next year. This starts on the assumption that on the 28th of September this year, we have got the legislation through the states. So we need to make sure that we do as much as possible, and we'll come on to that right at the end as to what you can do, but do as much as possible, be with us all the way through, be on the state steps to make sure that it goes through on the 28th. But if it does go through on the 28th, then 1st of October is the first sign that you will see that it is actually in force. There will be loads of training, there'll be loads of guidance coming out, so there'll be stuff coming, but the businesses have said they need a whole year really to get everybody trained, to get people up to speed, to change their policies, practices. Which does beg the question, was it that bad? But hey ho, we're sort of happy that we've got a date. We would be very unhappy if it moves further back. We are perhaps be okay if it moved further forward, but we recognise that the businesses need some time to prepare. So we're very pleased that that date is actually in the ordinance. So there's not another thing coming that may or may not get through the states. This is it. So if it goes through the states and it says it's in the 1st of October will be the commencement, we will be there commencing on the 1st of October next year. There's other stuff coming. So education won't be before the 1st of September 2025. That's because education needs to do stuff their end as well. And we need to make sure that the two match together. The next phase, the phase 2, is age, which will be great for age because there is nothing at all in terms of protection for the ground of age at the moment, and then replacement of other stuff. Intersectional discrimination just means where things are, you know, I may be a lesbian woman that is a Catholic and I can be discriminated against differently than if I was a male Jew or, you know. So I think, you know, that intersectional discrimination is important, but it's probably not going to be important to many people. It'll be important to the nerds like me and Rob, and it will protect people differently, slightly. But in terms of how we get there, the main thing is to make sure that as many areas are covered and protected from discrimination as possible. So, looking way over to this side, you can see that some things will be going into the next term. So we won't be just campaigning this term, we will have to do our normal hustings for the new states members when they come in and make sure that equal pay for work of equal value comes in. But more importantly for us guys, the physical features and accessibility is 5 years after the implementation of the first bit. So it is really important that that happens and that the action plans that the states are meant to be drawing up also happen. So we're very close and we feel on the threshold of something brilliant, but we ain't there yet, I'm afraid. Right, I shall just hand over to Karen for a sec, because I did mention what might be coming and what other things will be happening between now and October next year.
Okay. I think we were going to use this as an opportunity for Peter and Ellen to come down, if that was okay. I'm just going to be a little filler. Thank you, Carol. I think quite a lot of people are worried about the context of all this. It's obviously quite a difficult topic and a very, very big topic. So just wanted to use this opportunity to advertise the consortium. So the Guernsey Disability Alliance is one of the stakeholders or consortium members. So the primary ones are Walkers and the Institute, which is often known as a collaborative of the Guernsey College of FE and GDA and Health and Social Care Training. And they were commissioned by ESS probably a year ago now, Jill, something around that. And we, as the GDA and as Equality Guernsey, are one of those members. And they'll be producing 5 different sessions that anybody can go to. You can be a business, an individual, a charity, member of the states, absolutely anybody. And they start with the foundation course, which is about equality, diversity and inclusion. Then the introduction to the ordinance, employers' responsibilities, service providers' responsibilities, accessibility and reasonable adjustment. So they will be quite detailed. They're about 90 minutes. They'll probably be, probably about 50 minutes an hour of content and questions. They will be delivered between October this year and March 2023. And they will be delivered in person at the Performing Arts and online, and after the last one they'll also be recorded. So you can actually start booking those now. It's been live for a few weeks and you can either book via the site, or you can see in the top corner there's an Eventbrite booking, or you can call the number at the Institute. So just really wanted to say to people, this isn't a one-off. So Other members of the consortium that are really important, especially for the work that we do around disability, is the Guernsey Employment Trust. Nikki's here, and Barry, and Elaine's involved as well. So they're doing great work. Nikki's done some fabulous videos so we can tell case studies of persons with disabilities, and they can give lived experience, which is brilliant. There is also her Focus HR, so they will give a HR background, and then through Equality Guernsey is ourselves. Have I covered everyone? Yeah, thank you. And the only other news about the consortium resources, there's one other party, and that's Appleby, and they'll be providing, now let me get the term right, guidance notes. Thank you. Sometimes I call them the wrong thing. And Appleby's guidance notes will basically accompany that as well. So you have training and you'll have notes. And then when we have the new Employment Equal Opportunities Service, that will be where mediation and other resources or information will be available. So I hope that makes sense, because as I say, there's an awful lot coming out. And again, you can book that now and share that, and that's for anyone. Is that okay? So I think now we are going to move to the questions for the panel. So how we're going to do this, thank you, need that one, is Trudy's very generously offered, if you could just pass me that one to help you as well, to be our adjudicator. So if you've got any questions, hold your hands up. It just takes a second. And if you're online, you use the chat box. Is anybody in the chat besides me, Ollie? And what we do is we take one from the floor and then one online. So just so you're aware, we are recording this. It is live, and there will be a recording that will be up later. So I'm afraid it's slightly complex. So when Trudy comes to you, she will be coming to you with two microphones. One is for the online recording, and the other is so that people in the room can hear. So don't be put off. She'll ask you to hold one, and then she'll aim one at you. So, but please, the idea tonight is to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions of Deputy Peter Roffey. Give us a wave. I'm sure many of you know. President of the Committee on Driving Everything Forward Politically. Fabulous Ellen Pragnall, that we've worked with for the last 4 years. It feels like forever, Ellen. Fabulous insight. Unfortunately, Sarah can't join us tonight, but Ellen's exceptionally capable. And of course, our own Carol LePage. And then if we need anything from me, I'm sure there's nothing you can't answer, or Nikki, or I will be around. So would anyone like to present the first question? Don't be shy. It's your opportunity.
Just link that to microphone.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah. This is what it will look like.
I might have missed what you said about the training,
Yes.
the consortium, but it just dawned on me, is training going to be made available for people with disabilities themselves to understand what their rights are? Particularly I'm thinking about people with learning disabilities and sort of more cognitive impairments, so they can understand more about what their rights will be when the legislation gets through.
What a fabulous question. Want me to answer that? Yeah,
I think Ellen's probably the best place to answer this.
I mean, obviously anybody can access. It's not just for employers, the training that's going on, so anybody can access it. And so to understand your rights as an individual, you could certainly sign up. Whether you want, are you talking about thinking about particularly tailored training, though, specifically for perhaps people with disabilities? I'm not sure that has been covered so far, but I'll check.
That's what I was thinking of, because the consortium training is going to be aimed maybe perhaps at a different level that some people might find difficult to understand, and to be able to understand your rights, it needs to be delivered at
I think that's a really good point, and it's I can see Jill trying to come in at the back. Sorry, we need about 8 microphones in the room, don't we?
The training, I think, very good point. We will be looking at producing an easy read guide, which will go some way towards explaining people's rights and what the legislation will mean. We did that for the policy proposals 2.5 years ago, so we would definitely be looking to do something like that. But the training is something that I think we can probably take away and think about.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Really useful suggestion, thank you.
there's one there.
I just wanted to say it's training free.
It's free for the people being trained. Obviously, somebody has to pay for it. So we've had a budget from the States, so we will. The people doing the training aren't working pro bono, unfortunately. But yeah, there will be no financial barrier to getting the training.
Last time you said there was some resistance from other states members.
How's that going?
I'll probably be the last person to know. If I was going to predict, I would be really disappointed. I don't expect the legislation not to pass. My worry is what sort of amendments might be put to it and what form it will pass in. And I'm only definitively aware of one amendment, which I think is not something to be concerned about. But that doesn't mean that there aren't half a dozen other pernicious ones being planned. And as I say, I'll be the last person to actually find out about it. I bet Deputy Gollop probably knows more what's going on behind the scenes than I do.
I got the impression.
Well,
I got the impression that there is some activity, but I know no more than that. I think states members are aware they've only got a week or so to do these amendments, and it will mean when they're published, although this stage will suspend the rules from time to time, to be honest, that members, activists, experts, lobbyists, even the corporate sector should respond appropriately, quickly, as Carol always does.
yeah, what I would say is that all politicians have a populist side, and therefore the more members of the states think which I genuinely believe, which is that there's widespread support for this legislation in the island, the less likely it is to be derailed. So I'm delighted that all the mainstream employer organisations have come out in favour of this sort of legislation. They may have arguments about various little tweaks in it, in the same way that Carol felt some compromises have gone too far. Some of them may have felt it's not compromised quite far enough. But by and large, they've come out and said they want to see this legislation now progress. I think the public has accepted it. We know sort of civil society groups, not just the GDA, but many others, are strongly in favour of it. But I think that impression needs to be got across. So I think states members do need to be made aware about the breadth and depth of support for it, because I think that will make it far less likely for it to become derailed at the end of the month.
This isn't a question, but just to add to what you said, and from my understanding as a member of the consortium who's going to deliver the training, even if there is a delay, we're still going ahead and delivering the training as planned anyway, on the assumption at some point it will come in. So people don't let that put you off booking, like waiting to see if it goes through, because the training is going to go ahead anyway. And in with regards to accessibility of the content, the videos are, I think they're fairly accessible because they have people's lived experiences, and the hope is that we will get subtitling added to the videos as well, just as, you know, another layer of accessibility. So.
I think two things. You said, I think from the slide, the carers, part of the legislation, the carer had to be living in.
Or a close relative.
Yeah. Right, so a carer that's not living in, can you explain why that's excluded? And secondarily, how similar is this to UK legislation that case law will be easy to come by?
Okay. The history to this is compromise all along the way. I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of different carers. Professional carers are very much in a different category. We're talking about people who are caring because of association with the person concerned. And so in the vast majority of cases, those will be people either in the same household or with a strong connection. I can't remember exactly what the arguments were to actually limit it exactly to that. I know it was talked about quite a lot in the consultation process. Is your memory any better than mine, Ellen?
I think businesses were concerned about, having an enormous pool of potential people that were covered by the ground of carer status. So decision was taken to sort of pare it back, but hopefully it still covers the vast majority of cases, we would hope, because it covers people who are living with the person that they're caring with, or not necessarily, or a close relative of the person that they're caring with. And in that case, you don't actually have to be living with the person. So if you're looking after an elderly parent, for example, or a disabled adult child, but you don't live with them, then you would potentially still be covered by the ground of carer status.
What I would just add to that is that Guernsey is fairly much at the cutting edge here in avant-garde in actually having carer status as a protected ground. So I think we've got to carry the whole community with us, including the employers and the people with the onus on them to not discriminate. I think because we're moving into ahead of many other territories, I think there needed to be a little bit of balance actually in there. But as Ellen says, I think this will probably cover at least 90% of sort of carer situations, but I can understand it would be frustrating for somebody who feels that they're excluded from that because they neither live with somebody nor is related to them. Sorry, back to Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, this ordinance will be subject to review as well at sort of key points after phase 1 is introduced and after phase 2 is introduced. So if we find that there is a group of people that are being excluded from protection, then that's something that could be built into the review, and the output of the review could be a recommendation to change the definition. So I think it's something that we sort of need to monitor. I hope it's not going to be a problem, but if it is, it could be picked up at a later stage.
So you mentioned case law as well. The GDA looked at, I think it was about, well, let's face it was Rob, looked at about 46, I think, different countries, and the Lucy and Siobhan, who are from the university in Ireland, in Dublin, who specialise in this type of legislation, looked at 6 English-speaking countries' legislation, and they were the advisors on this. And whilst case law isn't, you don't have to follow case law. Persuasive. It is persuasive. So where I was saying about those specific phrases, those have quite a bit of case law behind them. So some specific wording hasn't been altered from, say, Jersey or the UK. It is still the same as other countries, and that case law, when you are looking at those types of definitions, will still be used by the tribunal.
Will there be a requirement to define how much caring a carer delivers? I'm thinking in particular about the there are lengthy criteria when applying for severe disability allowance and carers allowance about how many times a day you have to do something for somebody during the day, during the night, how many hours can you leave them unsupervised, etc., etc. So to what extent does one have to define how much you care for a person?
Well, the wording in the law is on a continuing, regular or frequent basis. So the law doesn't set out so many hours per week or whatever. But I think that the tribunal will, so long as, basically it's not an occasional arrangement. So long as it's a persisting arrangement and it's relatively frequent on a regular basis, I think the tribunal will take that as being included within the definition. Sorry. Ellen.
Just to add to that, there's absolutely no link whatsoever to severe disability benefit and the requirements, as you state, for there to be a very high level of care for somebody to qualify for carers allowance. So you don't need to qualify for carers allowance to be protected under the ground of carer status. Okay, so we're talking about a much lower bar than that. But still
quite subjective.
It is, well, yes, it will be for the tribunal to consider the facts of the case.
And then would they potentially compare my situation with some case law?
Is that
what would happen if it was difficult to decide?
There may be case law in Ireland which they could look to, because there is a similar ground in Ireland which is actually broader, but there is no carer status ground in either Jersey or the UK, which is generally, you know, where our tribunal would look to for their case law. So I think the case law will actually develop in Guernsey.
I just wondered if there was a definition of relative.
There is. Somebody can read it rather than me doing it off the top of my head. And it is a common definition in other legislation as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. So this is a little bit, this is a bit tricky to follow. You have to sort of think about it a bit. Yeah. But so A is a close relative of B, and so B is the person with. So let's have a look at this. Sorry, a person A has carer status if A provides care or support on a continuing, regular or frequent basis for a person with a disability B. Okay, so the carer is A, the person with the disability is B. So A is a close relative of B if either A or B is the spouse, partner, child, sibling, parent, grandchild, grandparent, or B, parent or child of a spouse or partner of the other. So you do have to take your time to think about this, but in summary, it is relatively wide. It sort of covers.
So closely related to you or closely related to your other half.
Yes,
basically what that's right.
It's basically the summary. Yeah, so it's going to cover your parents, you know, your grandparents, your children, and any sort of combination.
And I think we did clarify that was stepchildren,
yes, stepchildren
and also
as well.
Adopted and
foster children.
Foster children was the word I was looking for. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yes.
It does miss people out.
Yeah. But it doesn't cover cousins, no.
Yes, that's true.
Just before I go to one of our online questions, just to clarify again, as Ellen and Peter were saying about there's not the case law, I'm not sure if everyone remembered earlier, in Jersey and other places like the UK, is used by association with, so it doesn't, carers are protected, but not as clearly. So I just want to be clear, it's new to Guernsey by it being a ground itself, just in other locations it's by association, just to be really clear. Right, we have an online question, it's going to be a goodie, get your reasonable adjustment facts out, and maybe we've got Get here as well that do a lot of work around reasonable adjustment. Many employers will see workplace adjustments as costly, so how do you proportion a reasonable adjustment?
Right, well, as I think has been pointed out earlier, actually it's a myth that most reasonable adjustments are costly. Most of them are actually incredibly cheap and simple to do. And if the answer is costly, then you look for a different answer by and large. But the concept of proportionality that's in the law means that there is a difference whether you're working for a small employer or working for a large employer. So, I don't know. The co-op or Waitrose will be expected to do something that the corner shop may not be expected to do because of proportionality. Now, from the person working for the small shop, that might be an issue. But I think that the law, it's important that we don't put a burden that people can't cope with. So, does that answer the question, or am I talking around? What exactly was the question again?
Yeah, I think it's that, and then sorry, it's that, and then I was just looking for it, but I haven't got it on our slides. Can you remind me, Ellen, that, you know, like the 5 criteria, so it must be reasonable, it mustn't be a financial burden, mustn't have a significant impact on the other staff. I'm not sure if anyone's got it in their notes. I'm just trying to remember those off the top of my head. They'd be quite useful. So just while we're looking for those, reasonable adjustment isn't a new term. So it's a term that's used both in the UK, Jersey, Ireland, in fact, extensively. And it's something that Get, if that's fair to say, Nikki, is already doing an awful lot. If anyone's not aware of Guernsey Employment Trust, get.org.gg, and already doing a lot of work in this area. As I say, give Ellen a second to find the notes. But
Yeah, and there's a reason why we've used a lot of wording from other territories, and it comes back to this question of case law being persuasive, because the closer you actually, the concepts are the same wording, the easier it is for the tribunals to say, well, we can look for experience elsewhere and how it's been dealt with. And that these tribunals, unlike the current employment tribunals, are not always chaired by a legally qualified person. The tribunals will always have, as a chair, there may be lay people on them, but the chair will always be legally qualified. And I'm waffling on while Ellen tries to find the relevant point. It is quite a fat bit of legislation, so sometimes trying to find the exact page. If not, you can try and do it from memory and say, I think actually Karen probably did get it more or less right from memory what the 5 criteria are. So let's assume that Karen got that right.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
and while we deal with other questions, we will try to find the exact page. So any other? Yeah.
It's actually kind of a supplementary potentially. So far, the examples given of small or large employers has been the amount of people employed, but surely it would also include the amount of financial turnover of that company. I think that clarity would be appreciated, because it's not just the size of the workforce, it's the size of the financial turnover, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's whether it be an unfair burden. So you could have a really small but high value organisation that's got 10 employees, but they're all bringing in £3 million a year, and the expectation is they'd be able to afford a reasonable adjustment in a way that perhaps, as the corner shop I was referring to, wouldn't be able to. So you're absolutely right.
Okay, I've just found it, so if anyone wants to read from behind, sorry, I'll share this online in a minute. So, firstly, it needs to be appropriate and necessary. Secondly, it must not be a disproportionate burden. So that's what we were just saying, so I can't drive Carol's computer on that. And then, there we go, I've worked it out now. So yeah, it was pretty much what we were doing. I say to reassure people this is pretty much a global and certainly used within the Jersey, the UK and elsewhere. So firstly, whether it is appropriate and necessary. So for example, there's no point either an employer or goods and service provider going out and putting a lift when a lift's not necessary, or making a change that actually doesn't have an impact. And secondly, whether it's disproportionate burden to provide it. And then the disproportionate burden is basically saying it's financial, and also the impact it would have on others, which was what we were saying before, and will it satisfy the needs, so i.e. will it make a difference to the individual. So I think we pretty much covered that there. Sorry, it took me a while to find that. What I do online is share that fact sheet with everybody who's online.
I mean, the one point I would make, I'm going to try and get across to, I don't need to make it here, I'm sure, but my fellow states members, is that we keep talking about these are concepts in this law and that law. Listening to some of the debate in Guernsey over the last couple of years, you'd think we were taking a leap into some kind of unknown new world that no other territory has done. The reality is we're about the last of the party, catching up with the rest of the civilized Western world. So I really hope that can be got across, because this is actually, we've been incredibly tardy, and I think we should be apologising to the community for it, rather than sort of saying this is something dangerous that we're doing.
Carol, sorry, this is a nerdy question. I thought I'd had most of the issues sorted, but Carol reminded us about imputed disabilities. And we've also moved towards a definition that requires you to have a disability for 6 months or future. How do we measure the length of an imputed disability?
That is an interesting legal question, isn't it? Okay. And I'm not a lawyer. I mean, I think it is. It can be. First of all, moving towards the fact that you have to have a condition that has sustained or is likely to sustain for 6 months. It's been.
Fantasy conditions don't last 6 months.
Sorry?
But fantasy conditions don't last 6 months.
Yeah, but they may actually allege that you have a condition that, if it was real, would last for 6 months. Now, Look, I would personally have preferred a far less medical definition and far more social definition. This has been one of the areas where we have, as a committee, the ESS, if we wanted to get this legislation through, strike a balance, and we have moved perhaps the business community a long way from their starting point, and we've moved probably away from the starting point that people like the GDA would have liked to have had. So to some extent I apologise for that, but I don't, because I want to get this law through, and I don't think we will. As far as imputing conditions, I see somebody volunteering next to me, so I'm going to...
I don't know the answer to your question, Rob, but I think it must be okay in the sense that the Equality Act also has a similar imputed aspect to direct discrimination, and they also have a time limit, which is actually longer.
That bit of their law because it doesn't work.
Oh, right, okay.
I think it's hard to know.
Oh, right, interesting. Okay,
it only hit me now too, but
yes.
It does seem slightly...
Can I just go back to a really, really important point on the microphone, and that's this one, number 1. So maybe if you can, one of you who's got the microphone can repeat what I'm saying, because I haven't got one. Discrimination must take place first. So whether it's imputed or not, the whole point is discrimination must take place.
Yeah, thank you for emphasising that, because I mean that has been one of the difficulties. I've been talking about the definition of, let's take the definition of disability, but it's actually in all sorts of areas. People just assume that because somebody has got a protected ground that they'll be running to a tribunal. Well, in this, everybody's got a protected ground. Everybody's got a sexual orientation. Everybody's got a sex. Everybody's got a race. Doesn't mean that we're all down. The sex legislation, sex discrimination legislation now, but it's not. They're not overwhelmed because everybody has a sex. So really, the focus should not be on the definition, but whether or not discrimination is really taking place, and that's been hard to get across, particularly in perhaps. I mustn't mention them, but people who describe themselves as a think tank but don't seem to be any such thing. They feel if it's a wide definition, it means that there's going to be all sorts of abuse, and I just don't believe there's any evidence for that whatsoever. The first thing that a tribunal would look at, it wouldn't even get to a tribunal because there's a screening programme first, is there prima facie case that substantive discrimination has actually taken place here? And if it isn't, it doesn't matter if you can show you're covered by the protected ground. That's totally irrelevant. And if discrimination hasn't taken place, then the law is not engaged. So maybe, I don't know how I can get it across more clearly, but I will try to do it in the lead up to the debate.
Yes, thank you, and just I'm relatively late to this party, if you like, but thank you to everyone who's done all this work. It's quite incredible, really, and thank God we're getting there. And I was going to refer, you got quite close to naming the think tank and giving oblique references, and sadly, deliberately, I still receive their newsletter just to keep abreast of what is being said. So just, if you could help me, just with a very nice, succinct rebuttal of this point that they say about taken literally, the proposed definition of disability would have every Guernsey resident person defined disabled. So just give me a quite nice little soundbite I can give back to that. And then just secondly, while I've got the mic, when you were saying about everything we can do to support it going through, and I'll be on the steps on the 28th, but is there anything more, Peter, you would suggest we did in the meantime? So 2 questions in one.
Okay, well, first of all, I would refute the idea that everybody can say that they are covered by the grounds of disability, because unless you have, and we've seen, Carol put up the definition of impairment, and that impairment has to last for 6 months or to likely end of your life in an end-of-life situation, then you're not covered. But to some extent, it's irrelevant, because even whether you're covered or not, it's only if they, on the grounds of that disability, actually discriminate against you. So they're saying, what was their example? Something ludicrous like, I don't know, if you can't absorb a certain vitamin or whatever. Well, I cannot perceive of the case where employers or service providers are going to go around discriminating against people because they can't absorb vitamin B properly or whatever, or they wouldn't even know. I mean, it is really scraping the bottom of the barrel to try and find arguments against a piece of legislation which is, as I say, mainstream. If all of these dreadful impacts were going to happen. They would have happened in Jersey, it would have happened in the UK, they'd have happened everywhere else around the world where the legislation is in. What can you do other than being on the steps? I do think actually old-fashioned writing to states members, whether that's by email or these days it will tend to be email, in numbers and ideally not a uniform message that everybody sends out tops and tails, but actually coming from your own perception and written in your own words. I still think that's very powerful. I know when I'm on the receiving end of, you know, a few dozen of those, I start to think, well, you know, people care about this. And if you don't have any of that, it's easy to think that it's a competition between Deputy Roffey and Deputy whoever, and it's just an academic argument. But so knowing that people out there care about it and being on the steps will really help, and that's a really good thing to do. But writing as well, if you feel able to, those that feel able to, I think that would be great.
Can we just highlight, Peter, while you've got the microphone, that frivolous complaints will be thrown out? I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Either frivolous or vexatious complaints will be right at the beginning. There's a filter system to get rid of that. Yeah.
There's a bit of an argument there about imputed, and I'm not quite sure I fully understood what we meant by that, so I don't know if everybody else listening would. But secondly, before I lose the mic, one of the things that you can put forward is having no discrimination legislation stops people coming to work in Guernsey, and we have a major problem with vacancies in every field.
Okay. Imputed, I hope I get this right. I'm not going to employ you because you're Jewish. You're not Jewish, but I'm not going to employ you because you're Jewish. Yeah, I think I am, or I allege you are. I'm imputing one of the characteristics and discriminating on that basis, even though it's not actually real. You should be able to take that to a tribunal, and I shouldn't be able to say, actually, she's not Jewish, so she can't possibly be covered by the grounds that you can, because it's imputed. I hope I've got that right. Okay, fine, yeah.
We'll agree with that.
Explained it better than Google did.
Yeah. What was the other point?
For you to use in your arguments that having no discriminatory legislation here stops people coming to work in Guernsey across the board.
And it also stops us unlocking the full talents of our own community. And particularly as far as the disability grounds is concerned, for too many decades employers have been, not all employers, some great employers, I'm sure Ket will tell you there are, but too many have been focused on what people can't do and not what they can do. And it shouldn't need the economic circumstances, because this law is right in its own reason. And so even if we had mass unemployment, it will be important. But at the moment, where actually we've got skill shortages and labour shortages, if this law changes attitudes and allows people to just really focus on how they can employ people rather than the fact of thinking they're not the right person to employ, I think that would be a real major gain.
Something we maybe haven't covered that we're obviously very disappointed with, but understands happening now, is 5 years until physical features. In Jersey it was 2. So just that people are aware that it won't be covered for 5 years after. So that's 2028. Could you just I just want to emphasise that although that might not be the law, the key here is about best practice. So if anyone's listening in, if anyone from GET, or if you're an employment provider, there is lots of information out there. You can go to GET, you can go to others, Access, and some of the state's websites. We would always be encouraging anyone renovating, doing any work, looking at rebuilding, to be thinking about the accessibility around physical features. It is hugely important for inclusion and being able to take part in all areas of island life. So that is probably one of our biggest disappointments 5 years after it goes live. But again, best practice, please encourage people to consider those physical adjustments now.
I mean, best practice across the whole of the legislation, because actually the purpose of the law isn't to have hundreds of tribunals and hundreds of people being found guilty of breaching the legislation. It's important the tribunal system is in there, because if it isn't, then I don't think the law will have teeth. But the real success will be if we have very few tribunals, because it actually just makes the community think and changes attitudes. That is, I think, probably the biggest role I see for this law.
Thank you, Peter, because that highlights to us that we've been running an access course every other year, and this year the demand's been so high, we've run it twice this year. We're expected to run it 3 times next year. We have over 55 access consultants now in Guernsey. So again, the key thing around the legislation is changing behaviours, changing attitudes, and the fact that it's on its way is already starting to do that, and we're seeing that amazing pickup. So I think, unless anyone else, I haven't got any online unless you have, Ollie. We've got 3 minutes left. I think maybe should we ask the panel maybe to sort of give us 1 or 2 takeaways each. I think I like Linda's question, if that's all right, Linda. You know, what are the key things that we need to be letting deputies know about this legislation and why it's so important?
Shall I go? If I take that and go first, because I have a pre-prepared slide, but I don't want to steal your thunder, guys. So one of the things that we are doing is celebrating on the steps. So I think if I put that slide up and come back to you guys, we want as many people as is humanly possible, friends, relatives, anybody that you can drag from the pub, drag from the street, get them there, 8:30. We will allow you to be a little bit late. We'll be there at 8:30, but you can be a little bit later. But the states members do start turning up early. And I think that is one of the things that if we can have all of the grounds, so there's 5 grounds coming through on this ordinance, but there's also a load of other grounds that if this doesn't get through, don't believe that phase 2 is ever going to be seen, because it won't be. So all of the other grounds need to be there as well. And so anybody that you can think of, get them there. Make sure that you're supported, that they're supporting you, that you're supporting them, because we are all going to be protected by this legislation. We have got break for lunch. The deputies do come out at 12:30, so if you can get people down there then. We're going to try and get, weather dependent, Andre's said that he's going to come and sing for us in the Sunken Garden. We'll try and get some more acts to come down and sing, so there's a bit more of a party atmosphere and a bit of stuff going on. And if it carries on into the afternoon, which it possibly might do, to be honest, then we will still be there at 5:30 as well. So if you've got friends that can't make it at the morning, but they can make it when they finish work, get them down there so that we've got people there that are seeing them face to face. And I'll let the other 2 have a couple of words, and then I'll have another word with you, depending on what they say. So that's the main thing. Take away from today, come to the States, stand on the steps, be jolly, cheer people in. We'll be getting cupcakes and things from the Cheshire Home, hopefully some coffees. Might not have coffees for everybody, but hopefully we'll be joyous and jubilant, and very jubilant at the end if this comes through.
The one thing I would say maybe to Carol and the GDA is, I mentioned earlier about writing, emailing, contacting whatever deputies. It's not good enough for them, I think, just to do it and say, please support the legislation. Also keep an eagle eye for any amendment that's really going to take the guts out of it or lower its impact, because people might, I can see, I can hear deputies again saying, well, I've been lobbied to pass this. I'm going to pass this legislation, but I'm also going to vote for this amendment and that amendment that really makes it less effective. So you're going to have to be light on your feet and nuance your messages to states members as and when. Well, I hope none of that happens. I hope there won't be any amendments that really undermine it. But if that happens, be ready for it.
Thank you. Just a personal note of thanks. I've been working on this since 2017, so I am absolutely delighted that we've reached We've
got phase 2 to do next.
So I'd just like to thank all of the GDA's advisors and officers who've worked really closely with us in developing the policy proposals. I think they are much better for all of their very helpful input and support that you've provided along the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, second that.
Could we give our panel a round of applause, please? Same echoed back at you, Ellen. It's been a very, very rough ride, as our members know. Just a reminder that we are 15 years campaigning the day before the legislation goes. So when we mention the amendments, we will be in the Cotils on the 27th, which is the day before lunchtime, celebrating the campaigning we've done. But if amendments have come up, we will be explaining what they are, how it's happened. So please, if you want to know about amendments and what we're going to do, that's the latest possible opportunity. If there's any deputies listening in, I think we do have a few. Just a reminder that we have a drop-in here at the Cotils on the 19th of September. Carol and I and others will just be literally sat here if anyone would like to drop in and ask questions or talk about amendments. Carol, I think you wanted to finish. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, it was just to say thank you very much for all coming. If you have any other questions, Karen and I are also both available to ask. And I'd just like to say how wonderful it has been working with ESS, and you know the actual committee over the last 2 terms has been absolutely fabulous, and we would not have got this far without the likes of the committee that is currently led by and the absolutely amazing civil service, because you know they have been very knowledgeable. We've been very lucky in having a stable group that's been allowed to continue on this project, and it's you know been a pleasure to work with them, I have to say. And you know, long may it continue as we develop and move forward. But it is really important that we don't be complacent, that we do make sure that those messages, those personal experiences are given to States members. I think if you haven't had the newsletter and want a copy, just let Karen or Trudy know. And there's some other top tips that you can do in there. So from helping us with our media to making sure that you have written to your particular favourite deputy, or you can write to the whole lot. But
you don't have to do an individual one. There is a facility.
There is a facility, yes. Yeah. So there's a link on the, if you get the newsletter electronically, there's a link on there that takes you to the page where you can access all deputies' emails, home addresses, phone numbers. So don't just limit yourself to doing it by one old-fashioned method. You go for it, and that will influence them. And if you've got personal stories, that's even more hard-hitting. Anyway, I did say we were going to close at 8, and so I thank you very much. I'll be around, and Karen will be around for a bit longer, but I just like to say thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all on these steps on the 28th. Thank you very much.